These were men, they'd fought the Scots, they'd fought the Welsh, they'd fought the French. They knew what to do. They had a commander that they believed in, and they were disciplined, and they knew that if they did what they were trained to do, nobody was going to beat them. So there was a tremendous confidence.
Hello. On the 25th of October 1415, the Feast of St. Crispin, the English army under the command of the 29-year-old Henry V met the French on the field of Agincourt. The result was a victory to rank alongside Blenheim and Waterloo in the history of these isles. Joining today is Gordon Corrigan, author of A Great and Glorious Adventure, A History of the 100 Years' War, and most recently Agincourt, as he describes the background to Henry's reign and the build-up to the war and battle itself. Links are in the show notes, including parts 1 and 2 on Crécy and Poitiers. If you can leave a gentle review, I'd be hugely grateful. But before I hand you over to myself and Gordon, I'll leave you with a few lines from Henry V by William Shakespeare. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen, England now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. Gordon, welcome back to the pod. And actually, sharp-eared listeners will have just heard you talking about Operation Overlord, another conflict in France involving Englishmen and Frenchmen. But today we are going back in time a long way to the Battle of Agincourt, 1415. And Gordon, we've covered Crécy and of course Poitiers. And so this is the big one, really, Agincourt. And I was just listening back, and I thought it would probably be good to cover sort of the background to the campaign. Mm-hmm. And actually, after Poitiers, there's been a bit of internal strife in England, hasn't there?
Yes. I mean, in England, historically, whenever you get a child king or an incompetent king, then attention tends to turn inwards. And up to a point, that's what's happened in England, because the Black Prince has died far too early, just before his father, and his son Richard II is a child and is not a very satisfactory king anyway, and he upsets the magnates of the realm. There's long periods of attempted rebellions or attempted disagreements. And this goes on for a long time. And so instead of attention being paid to the war, which is still going on, but it's not being persecuted 100%, because people are much more concerned with what's happening internally and trying to look after their own interests in England, which are frequently, depending on who you are under threat from Richard II and his satellites. So not so much is going on in France. Similarly, in France, it takes them a very long time to recover from Poitiers. And of course, you've got the French king who's a prisoner in England, the Dauphin, his son, who's still in France, and considerable disagreement between them. Obviously, the king, who's a prisoner, mind you, a very comfortable prisoner, wants the whole business over and done with. Let's sign the treaty. Let's accept what the English want. Pay up my ransom and it'll all be over. And of course, the Dauphin is being badgered by his surrounding people not to do that. So messages are going backwards and forwards. A very large proportion of the government of France, the administrators of the country, have been killed or captured at Poitiers. So there's a huge breakdown internally. And all sorts of problems there, problems with the jacquerie, with the peasantry turn on their masters and whatnot. So again, not so much attention being paid to the war, to the external enemy, the English. Of course, back in England, eventually, Richard II who, it has to be said, either a brave young man or a foolhardy young man, because he dealt with the so-called peasants' revolt, who actually wasn't just the peasants revolting, but he dealt with that quite courageously. So as I say, either jolly brave or jolly foolhardy.
He was 14. I think in the last
Yeah,
episode I said he was
he was
16.
only a teenager. And as I say, he either was very brave or he just didn't realize the danger he was in, because they could quite easily have killed him if that is what they wanted to do. But he managed to convince them that actually he was on their side. And of course, once he lulled them into a sense of that everything was all right, then the ones that mattered were killed. Of course, Wat Tyler himself, if that was his name, was killed under circumstances that we still really don't know to this day. And really, the rebellion fizzled out, and Richard II and his courtiers, his council, dealt actually quite leniently with them. Now, when there was another uprising a few months later, then he was not at all lenient. They were rounded up and executed. But he upset a lot of the great men of the kingdom. Now, if you want to be a successful king in this period in England, you've got to keep the magnates on your side, because they're the big landowners. They're the people who are going to sign up troops or sign troops over to you for your wars and that sort of thing. And of course, they control Parliament, and Parliament is the money box. If you want to go to war and you want money, you've got to go to Parliament, and Parliament will authorize general taxation. And Richard just didn't do that. And of course, eventually Henry Bolingbroke, who is his cousin, is exiled. And when his father, John of Gaunt, dies back in England, the king, quite wrongly, with no legal justification whatsoever, simply appropriates the whole holdings of the Duke of Lancaster. Now, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was probably the richest man in the kingdom. He was probably the greatest landowner in the kingdom. And of course, as soon as he did that, the other magnates are thinking, shit, if he can do that to the Duke of Lancaster, what's he going to do with the rest of us? And that really set things going. And eventually, of course, Henry Bolingbroke comes back. He arrives back in England with only a very small little army with him. And Richard is persuaded to surrender. And eventually, of course, he's murdered. It was put out that I think he died of a broken heart. You don't actually die of a broken heart. I think we can safely say that he was done in the same way as you always do in a king or somebody whose body you have to exhibit. You smother them.
Not falling down the stairs or anything.
Not falling down the stairs. No, that's too problematical. You push somebody down the stairs, he may not break his neck and die. He may simply have a broken leg or something. You've got to do it all over again. It's like the nonsense more recently where they claimed that the death of Diana Spencer, ex-Princess of Wales, was deliberately set up by MI5 or MI6 or the Duke of Edinburgh, whoever you like.
Yeah, he was hiding behind the pillar, the Duke of Edinburgh, wasn't he?
You don't kill people that was not the way to assassinate people, because it's not definite. You can't guarantee that somebody's going to die in a car crash. There are far simpler ways of doing it. And similarly, going out to this period, I don't think there's any doubt that Edward II was smothered, Richard II was smothered, Henry VI later on is smothered. I mean, that would seem to me to be, and then because then you can exhibit the body and there are no marks. Whereas if you shoot them or stab them or strangle them, clearly there are going to be marks. But they've got rid of him. So Henry Bolingbroke,
who's eminently more capable, isn't he?
Far more capable. He's reigns as Henry IV, but he's got problems as well, because it's a disputed dynasty. Although nobody really liked Richard II, people are saying, well, hang on, Henry Bolingbroke is not the next claimant or the nearest claimant to the throne. There are others. And he spends most of his reign fending off revolution, insurrection, and all the rest of it, including, of course, Hotspur's rebellion.
Henry Percy.
Yeah, who was a great friend of young Henry V. In fact, he schooled the young Henry, the Prince of Wales, as he is now, Henry of Monmouth, in the sort of arts of war, and then turns against him. And of course, it all comes to a head at the Battle of Shrewsbury, when young Henry of Monmouth, later Henry V, is commanding one of the battles, as they call them, one of the divisions, if you like. Now, whether he was actually commanding it, or more likely, he's got some very experienced soldiers whispering in his ear. I remember when I was a very young officer commanding a company of 100 40 Gurkhas or something, all who had far more experience than I had, and a terribly good Gurkha captain who had 30 years service, who used to say to me, "Now, Sahib, I'm sure you've considered ABC." I hadn't necessarily considered ABC, but it's exactly what I did. And that's the way it works. And I'm quite sure it worked exactly the same way in medieval armies, where a prince or a king had to be seen to be commanding, but actually perhaps didn't have the experience so to do. And therefore he'd have somebody behind him. But he comes out of, young Henry of Monmouth comes out of the Battle of Shrewsbury exceedingly well. He is struck by an arrow, we think probably in his right cheek, because the surviving portrait of him, a very well known, it's in the National Gallery, shows his left face. Now that portrait was actually painted about 200 years after Henry V died, but it's thought that it was probably copied from contemporary paintings. So whichever side it was, he's struck with an arrow. Now, normally that could well be fatal, but it was removed by one of the farriers who actually created a tool for removing arrows, and his drawings of it and how he made it are actually in the British Museum. You can go and look at the original plans that this chap drew up, and then whether he himself made the tool or he said to one of the farriers make the tool, doesn't really matter. But the point was that the arrow head, which had embedded and probably had gone into the bone, now it must have been absolutely at the last leg of its range, because normally an arrow from an English longbow, if it hits you in the head, it'll go through you, it'll kill you, that'll be it.
Really, they're that powerful, they can go straight.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, they reckoned it would go through an inch of oak at 300 yards. And even if that's a bit of an exaggeration, it was incredible. Yeah, I mean, they really thumped very, very hard. And I've tried them out actually with a bow that was made, funnily enough, given to me by a Frenchman, which was made exactly as the original English longbows were. And they had a pull of about 100 pounds. Now, I'm an infantryman, 30 years in the infantry, a jungle soldier carrying very heavy weights all the time. So I thought this will be no problem at all. And I had a hell of a job just drawing it. Now, I've picked up weights much more than 100 pounds weight, and I've carried much, but my shoulder, of course, wasn't developed. I had a real job pulling this thing. And when I did manage to shoot an arrow, again, which was made to the same plans as the original medieval arrows, it really, the thump is considerable. So, for example, if it hit a man in plate armor, if it didn't go through the plate, it'll knock him off his horse. That's how powerful they were. So Henry Monmouth later was jolly lucky, and the chap who removed it, in fact, it was the surgeon, the farrier had made the tool, the surgeon, Bradbourne, I think was his name, removed it, and then they packed the wound with honey, which is an antiseptic, and a poultice. We don't know what the poultice was made of. And fairly quickly, the king recovers. Now, we were bloody lucky, because if the archers, and it became a bit of a habit in those days, if the archers had dipped the arrowhead in human feces, which was one of the things they did deliberately, then, of course, that would have poisoned, and probably he wouldn't have recovered, but he did. And really the point I'm getting to is that he behaved very well. He showed he was courageous. Now, whether he was really commanding it or doing what he was told to do is irrelevant. But he comes out of that exceedingly well. But poor old Henry IV does spend most of his reign having to look inwards. And he really doesn't have much time to pursue the war. He does develop artillery. Now, artillery is really in its infancy. It's certainly not yet sufficiently mobile to be used as field artillery, but they're starting to be able to use it as siege artillery. It's not very efficient. The way of making powder, they haven't really worked out how to make their gunpowder consistent. So if your powder is consistent, then X pounds of explosive will shoot a ball X thousand yards. But of course, if it's not consistent, you don't know how far it's going to shoot it. The making of cannon, very primitive, mainly bars of iron, sort of welded together, stone cannonballs. And if the gunners got wrong, the whole thing blew up, and there were lots of gunners being killed. But it's something he did do. I mean, that was something that the English artillery has moved a bit.
And you've mentioned the bow and the effect it had, and I suppose dipping in the arrowhead in feces is an early form of sort of chemical warfare. But the bow itself, has it changed since Crécy and Poitiers? Are we still talking similar design?
It's still pretty well the same thing. Probably originally not a weapon of war at all. It's probably for hunting. And of course, the bow as a weapon is as old as civilization, if you like. There were bows and arrows at Hastings, but they were short bows. So they were useful, but not the weapon that the longbow was. And it's probably the longbow arrived by simply people wondering, if I make it a bit longer, will I get more range? How should it be? And the period we're talking about, and really throughout the 100 Years' War, the bow is the height of the archer. So if you're a 6-foot archer, you have a bow which is 6 feet. If you're a 5'2" archer, which would be more likely, then you have a bow of 5'2". The pull is anything between 70 pounds and 100 pounds. And again, rather like Scottish pipers who start piping when they're about 9, archers, young men, did the same thing. And there were all sorts of rules, really, from Edward I onwards about practicing. Archers had to, every free man had to keep a bow and a number of arrows, and they had to practice, usually after church on a Sunday. And the point is that they developed the muscles to be able to constantly pull this 100-pound bow. There were some bodies dug up after the Battle of Towton, or Towton, depending on how it's pronounced, not all that long ago. And they thought that it was one of the mass graves after the battle, which is one of the Wars of the Roses, as it became to be called, battles. And they thought these chaps were deformed at first. And then they realized they weren't deformed, they were archers. And the reason they thought they were deformed was the way their right chest and right shoulder had developed. And this was all to do with training to be an archer. So you couldn't take John Soap out of the mud and say, you're an archer, here's a bow and arrow, and here's how you shoot it. You took a long time to train them. And as the war goes on, I mean, right from the beginning of the war, right up to the period we're looking at now, 1415, the proportion of archers in the army grows and grows and grows until really it settles down to 3 archers to 1 man-at-arms. Now, of course, the advantage is an archer was cheap. Archer was on 6pence a day, whereas a man-at-arms was a shilling a day if he wasn't a knight and 2 shillings a day if he was. The archers were more flexible because when they weren't archering, when they weren't shooting arrows at people, they could be used as, because of course they're all mounted by this stage, they could be used as scouts, they could be used to route recce and all that sort of thing. And this settled down as the standard English way of waging war. You found a bit of ground that suited you, where you could anchor both flanks so that you weren't going to be attacked from the side or the rear. You put your archers on each flank, your men-at-arms, your infantry in the middle, and you tried to persuade the enemy to attack you, because that was the way you could make most use of your archers. And it was a devastating weapon. I mean, an archer to be accepted in the army had to be able to loose 10 arrows a minute. Now, when I said it's a 100-pound ball, 10 arrows a minute, and keep on doing it. So the result, of course, is that if we look at, we get to Agincourt, where there are, we think, 5,000 archers and about 900 men-at-arms. Well, that means in 30 seconds, 25,000 arrows. That's incredible.
It is. I mean, it makes me feel almost sorry for the French army.
Well, indeed. And of course, the French had worked out long before what it was that was defeating them, but they simply couldn't change. Now, you and I might say, well, hang on, if you can't beat them, join them. That's what's killing us, so let's take it up ourselves. They couldn't do it. And they couldn't do it because of the way their society was structured. Now, in England, despite the fact that you've got sort of rebellions and uprising and every so often, essentially, it was a kingdom that was reasonably happy with the social order. Uprisings from the lower orders are very, very rare indeed. And even the peasants' revolt was not against the king, it was against his evil advisors and that sort of business. Whereas in France, it was very much still a feudal society. You daren't arm the lower orders, because if you did, they might turn against you. Now, of course, that wasn't the view in England, where the lower orders were armed. They were the archers. You daren't do that in France. And lots of Frenchmen realized, but they knew they simply couldn't do it. society in France was absolutely stultified. It didn't move. Whereas one of the things about English society at this time, in many ways, it was more mobile than it is today. I mean, it was quite common during the Hundred Years' War period for somebody, I mean, somebody like, you take somebody like Camoys, he joins as an archer. He's a private soldier and he does well. So he's promoted to be a vingtenar, which is a command of 20, so platoon commander, if you like. And he continues to do well. And he's made a centenar, so he's commanding 100 archers. And he does well, and he's knighted, and eventually he ends up knighted and commanding an army. And there are quite a few like that. They advanced by ability in the field. Now, today, I'm afraid, jolly good though our private soldiers are, it doesn't matter how good they are, they're not going to end up as generals.
Yes, it's we were talking about Robertson, I remember, on our great war commanders.
Yeah.
And
he's one of the, in fact, really the very, very few. There was one during the Peninsular War, a Welshman who did end up as a general. It's just not possible to get all the courses in and the experience and everything else. Today it couldn't happen. But it did happen during the 100 Years' War. Society was mobile. Society recognized ability and was quite prepared to promote somebody who really came from very humble origins indeed, because if they did well.
Yeah. So we have an idea of the English army.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I've read my Shakespeare and Henry V, and Henry has ascended to the throne, and then the Dolphin, as they call the Dauphin, the Dauphin, has sent tennis balls to Henry, and this is a gross insult. And so this is the reason for Henry campaigning in France. That's not quite right, though, is it, Gordon?
No. I mean, Shakespeare's wonderful, and some of his soliloquies that he puts into Henry's mouth are some of the best prose in the English language. Some of it, we don't actually know what Henry V said before Harfleur or before Agincourt. He would have said something, but we don't know. No, the reason, quite simply, is that father dies, he comes to the throne in 1413. Now, it's still a disputed dynasty. There are still people saying, well, actually, you're not really the legitimate heir to the throne. It's the Earl of March is much closer family connections than you have. So he's got to do something. He's got to prove that he actually is a king, that he can govern. And the easy solution, or perhaps not easy solution, is to prosecute the war. And he's quite certain from the time he comes to the throne that he is going to prosecute the war. He's going to chase up these English demands that have always been there. And he starts to raise an army. He starts to call up soldiers, sign up soldiers, get ships together and everything else. And he sails off in late July, for Harfleur. Now, when he embarks the army in all the ports, but they gather together at Southampton, or the ships gather at Southampton, we think about 1,500 ships. The sources vary, but 1,500 is probably about right. He's got 9,000 archers and 3,000 men-at-arms. Now, one of the reasons we know how big the English army was in this war, whereas we're never really quite sure how big the French army was quite simply because the English army is a professional army. And if it's a professional army, they've got to be paid. And therefore, there are records. Records of when people were signed up, how much they got paid and all the rest of it. So we know he's got 9,000 archers, 3,000 men-at-arms. But of course, there are also a hell of a lot of other people who go as well. There are grooms, there are blacksmiths, there are farriers, there are miners. He took a whole lot of miners from the Forest of Dean in case he had to tunnel under walls. There'll be a few priests around. So there are also, and clerks, there are all sorts of other people, sort of hangers on. So if he has 12,000 soldiers, he's probably altogether about 15,000 people.
Sorry, Gordon, to interrupt. 9,000 archers, 3,000 men-at-arms, cavalry?
Yeah. Well, they're all mounted.
The men-at-arms are, and the archers.
Everybody's on a horse. The whole army is mounted. So, because by this time, the English armies are mounted, so they move quickly, they move on horseback, but they get off their horses and they fight on foot. And this is the tactical, this is the breakthrough. This is one of the revolutions in military affairs, of which professionalism is one, being mobile but fighting on foot is another. And of course, there are spare horses and there are baggage wagons. So there's a huge number of people and horses and animals that have got to be shipped across to France. So, and as most of the boats would have been cogs, which would carry maybe 20 or 30 passengers plus the crew, probably 1,500 ships is about right. Some historians say, no, they couldn't possibly have that many ships. But as we know, they all went over in one lot. In other words, they weren't being shuttled across. 1,500 ships is probably about right. Until they've actually set sail, nobody knows where they're going, because, of course, he cannot hide from the French that he's readying an expedition to go to France. It's quite impossible to hide that. What he has to try and do is hide where he's actually going to land, because he could have landed in Normandy, which was basically friendly. He could have landed in Calais. He could have gone straight across. What he actually decides to do is to land at Harfleur. Now, that was sensible because it's at the mouth of the Seine. And if he can take Harfleur, he can therefore block the Seine. Now, the French shipyards were up at Rouen. And as we know, this is long before Britannia ruled the waves. The French were much more experienced naval warriors than the English. And French naval raids on the English coast were a problem. And also naval raids on the wine trade going backwards and forwards from Aquitaine. Or again, he could have landed in Aquitaine, which after all was English. So by landing at Harfleur, he can block the Seine. No French shipping now can come out of the shipyards. And equally important, no French trade can get to Paris, because a lot of French imports came up the Seine to Paris. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, he hoped that when he besieged Harfleur, he could take it in a matter of days, a few days, he thought. In fact, it took him 5 weeks, took him 36 days. And the reason it took so long was, first of all, the garrison were well provided. They had lots of rations. They had water within the town that they could get. And they had a jolly good commander. The Sire de Gourcourt was a very competent soldier, and he knew how to defend. So it took him much longer. He never actually had to assault the town as such, because the form in those days, if you were under siege, was that you normally came to an agreement that if you weren't relieved by a certain date, you would surrender. And that was all to do with the unspoken laws of war, which were that if the besieger, the attacker, had to actually assault the town, which would mean all sorts of casualties, then they could do what they liked. They could loot, they could kill everybody, do what they liked. And obviously everybody wanted to avoid that. The besieger wants to avoid it because it's casualties for him. The besieged want to avoid it. So the agreement was that if they couldn't be relieved, and they weren't relieved, so they surrendered. So he's now got Harfleur, but...
So there's no once more unto the breach, dear friends, we should point out.
No, they don't actually have to go to the breach. There isn't really a proper breach anyway. They've done a certain amount of damage with their rudimentary cannon, but not an awful lot. The initial idea was we take Harfleur in a couple of days and then off to Paris. But actually, it's now quite getting on in the year. It's a bit late, it's late September, early October, winter's coming on. What's he going to do? His other problem, of course, is that his soldiers do what I'm afraid Englishmen abroad always do. They eat well, but not wisely, of the local food. And the soldiery tucked into the oysters and the prawns and lovely seafood. Now, unfortunately, the really good prawns grow in sewage outlets. That's I mean, a prawn's an ocean-going turd, if you like. That's where you get the big fat prawns. And of course, they all went down, a hell of a lot went down with food poisoning. Now, it's thought that as many as 2,000 of his soldiers may have died of food poisoning from scoffing these oysters and mussels and prawns and God knows what. And another several thousand were too ill to go any further and had to be told, well, off you go home. So his army's been reduced. It's getting on in the year. Any question of going to Paris really is not on. What the hell is he going to do? Well, he can't just get into his ships and sail home, because Parliament, the magnates, are going to say, well, hang on, we voted you 1/10 of all the property of the church. Church was always good for hitting for taxes because they were a very rich organization. And the British were, or the English were always very suspicious of the church anyway. Suspicion of popes doesn't start in the Reformation. It goes way back before that, because the English always believed that the popes were in the pockets of the French, which they usually were. So you want to raise a tax, hit the church. We gave you all this money, and what do you got to show for it? Nothing. So he's got to do something. So what he decides to do, well, he could head for Aquitaine. That's really, Bordeaux's too far away. The answer is to head for English Calais, because Calais is relatively near. It's 170 miles from Harfleur. Head for Calais, hope to meet a French army on the way and defeat them. You can have a really good victory on a big French army, then you've achieved something. So he cuts down the baggage to a minimum, sets off with what he's got, probably about 5,000 archers at this stage, and about 900 men-at-arms. That's the reductions from food poisoning. And of course, he got to leave a garrison in Harfleur to stop the French reoccupying it. So off he goes, and the weather turns against him. Rations have to be cut and cut and cut. He keeps going. He can't get across the Somme as he thought he would be able to in a sort of straight line. So he's got to go along the Somme, inland, until eventually he can steal a march on the French and get across the Somme. When he gets up, he's crossing rivers. And eventually on the 23rd of October, he gets to the Ternoise, and he's crossing that, and he sees it's what we in the army call an oh shit moment, because there on a ridge in front of him is the whole of the French army, all in battle array. And we have all sorts of attempts to say how many there were. Now, you can understand a sort of clerk or priest not really knowing how to count people, but professional soldiers really have to be able to work out how many the enemy are, because depending on how many enemy there are, it's whether you fight or whether you bugger off. And even the chap who wrote the Gesta Henrique Quinta, who was there, he said that the French army was 180,000 strong. Now, clearly it couldn't have been. You could not keep an army of that size in the field in October. That just isn't possible. So why did the chap who was there, why does he think there are as many as that? And the best explanation that I've come across is Ian Mortimer's, who's a well-known.
He's been on the podcast. Friend of the show.
Well, he's a cracking good medieval historian and historian of this period. I mean, he and I disagree on whether Edward II was murdered or whether he, in fact, got away to Italy. And he and I disagree on that. But otherwise, he's very sound. And his view is that given that the French army was feudal, that it was nearly all mounted, that each knight would have had another couple of spare horses plus a baggage horse. He'd have a couple of pages. So if everybody, the grooms and the pages and everybody else, were riding the spare horses, then at a distance, and the English army was about a mile away, then at a distance, if you counted everybody, then you might well come up with a figure like 180,000. But actually, the combat strength wouldn't have been anything like that. And they spend several hours looking at each other, and then the French army withdraws. Now, I think the reason they withdrew, and I've been on the ground and looked at it, was that if the French army were going to have a crack at the English army, they'd have to cross the river. There was only one bridge, and that would have been a killing area, and they weren't going to do that. That would have been a very silly thing to do.
Who was in command of the French army?
Well, this is one of the problems, because instead of having one commander, they had a number of commanders. The Constable of France was there, who was one of the commanders. The Captain General of France was there. There were a number of the French royal family, all expected to be consulted. Lots of dukes. Everybody sort of thinking they didn't have to answer to anybody, and there was divided command. This has always been the big problem. There wasn't a clear chain of command, so people tended to do what they do their own thing. Whereas the English army, there was a clear chain of command. There was the king, then there were the various battle commanders. They call them a battle, which is slightly confusing. But the three divisions of the army, each had their own commander. There was a commander of the archers. The battle commander, the divisional commander, would have known who his subordinate commanders were. So everybody knew who they answered to and who the ultimate command was. And that just wasn't the case in the French army, which was feudal. The feudal system might have worked hundreds of years previously, but it didn't work now. It didn't work when you were up against a professional army, which the English army was. I mean, the English army, we would recognize it today in the way it was structured and the way it worked. Whereas the French army just wasn't like that.
And I suppose with their professionalism, they're also, despite being outnumbered, they're confident.
Yeah, I mean, they were wet, they were sick, they were starving. They'd left a trail of diarrhea and vomit all over northern France. One of the accounts says that instead of dropping their trousers every so often because they had a form of dysentery, that they just took their trousers off and tied them around their waist. Well, riding a horse without any trousers, no, that's nonsense. But it indicates just the problem. I mean, they were in an awful state, but these were men. They'd fought the Scots, they'd fought the Welsh, they'd fought the French. They knew what to do. They had a commander that they believed in, and they were disciplined, and they knew that if they did what they were trained to do, nobody was going to beat them. So there was a tremendous confidence. I mean, Shakespeare has had the night before, the French army withdraws back to Agincourt, and the English follow them up to as far as Maisoncelles, which is a village just this side of Agincourt. And the night before the battle, so the night of the 23rd, Shakespeare has Henry going round in disguise, pretending to be anybody, to try and gauge morale. That is rubbish. He'd been with them for months. They all knew who he was. He'd have known every officer by name, and he'd have known quite a few of the senior NCOs, equivalent sergeants as well, and they would certainly all have known him. He certainly wouldn't have found it necessary to go around wondering what morale was like and pretending to be a private soldier. That's just nonsense. So there they are. Then next morning,
and this is St. Crispin's Day, which
is indeed St. Christmas Day. Yeah, 25th of October. And they've had a pretty unpleasant night because some of them would have been billeted in the houses in Maisoncelles. But Maisoncelles was a tiny village. They couldn't have got the whole army in there. They had some tents, but the baggage had been cut to a minimum. Quite a lot of the baggage horses had been slaughtered and eaten. So there wasn't much. So they're all pretty wet and not totally good. The French say that the reason there was no noise coming from the English camp was because they were all terrified. No, the reason there was no noise coming from the French camp is because they're disciplined. You don't make a huge amount of noise at night, which wasn't the case in the French camp, where they're all gambling on how many people they're going to take prisoner and all the rest of it the next day. Well, the next morning, the English army is lined up at Maisoncelles, waiting. Now, the situation now is that Henry needs a battle, and he needs it quickly. He's got to get to Calais before his rations run out completely. The French don't. French don't need a battle. They can stay there forever and just wait until Henry's army starves and then has to surrender. So what Henry has to do is to persuade the French to attack him, because that's the English tactical play. And there doesn't seem to be any sign of the French attacking him. So he then orders the line to advance. He's got the men-at-arms in the middle, probably in 4 ranks, the archers on either flank, covering about 800 yards, 900 yards total. So they start advancing slowly, until actually they can anchor their flanks. So the French missed a trick here, because in fact, for once, the French are on the slightly higher ground. It's not a huge difference, but they are on the higher ground, whereas the English tactic was to secure the high ground and let the enemy attack you. But he does manage to advance the English army so that the right flank is anchored on a wood and the left flank is anchored on the wood of Agincourt. So he's found somewhere he can anchor his flanks, and the French still haven't attacked. So what he's got to do is try and provoke them. So he tells a wonderful chap called Sir Thomas Erpingham. Now, Sir Thomas Erpingham, who's 60 years of age, I may say, which rather gives the lie to the theory that everybody died at 40 in the Middle Ages, because they didn't. I mean, if you could avoid dying in childbirth and never living at all, and avoiding the plague and avoiding childhood illnesses and everything else, no reason why you shouldn't live to a ripe old age. In fact, the 3 battles three divisions that the men-at-arms are in. The king, of course, is commanding the centre one. Henry V is commanding the centre one. The Duke of York, who's his younger brother, is commanding the right-hand one. And the left-hand one is commanded by a chap called Lord Camoys. Now, Camoys is 65. Now, he's not a stripling. So anyway, the king says to Thomas Erpingham, look, give them a crack of arrows. And Erpingham says, can do, sir, but they are at extreme range, but we'll have a go. Erpingham rides out to the front of one flank and says, right, lads, stand by, over to the other flank, stand by. When I throw my baton in the air, let them have it. So Erpingham rides out to the front, throws his baton in the air, and the archers on either flank start shooting their arrows. And in the first 30 seconds, 25,000 arrows come down. And they're extreme range, but they do start hitting the French heavy cavalry, which are on the flanks. And this gets up the nose of the French cavalry, to coin a phrase. Actually, we're not coining it, it's an old phrase. Whereupon the commander of the cavalry on the right, or the chap who's the most senior or most well-bred on the right, said, what? We're not having this. Charge. So they crack on. The other flank sees this and they're not going to miss out. So the cavalry now comes not galloping because it's been raining for days. It's very sticky mud, very sticky clay. I doubt if they might have just been in a bit of a canter, but and of course, as they approach, the nearer they get, the more effect the arrows have. So if the arrows aren't hitting the knights, they're hitting their horses. You stick an arrow in the quarters of a horse, it's going to dump you and piss off, you know. So it was absolute carnage. And even if they got anywhere near the archers, and some of them did, the archers way back, Henry had told them to cut stakes. Now, not every archer had a stake. I calculated it's about 1 in 5, and they'd put these sharpened stakes out in front of them as an anti-cavalry obstacle. So anybody that did get there couldn't get at the archers anyway. So the rest of the army, which has learnt something from Crécy and Poitiers, that they are actually on their feet. So the first French division starts moving down the hill. I think they're about 3 times the size of the English army.
About 18,000 then.
Yeah, I'd say 3 to 1. It may well be more than 3 to 1, but conservative estimate. Let's be realistic. One of the problems, of course, in medieval battles is that if you lose, you exaggerate the size of the enemy because it's more excusable to be beaten by them. And if you win, you exaggerate the size of the enemy because then it makes your victory look more spectacular, more splendid. So that first division of the French starts moving down the hill. And of course, they're in plate armor and they do get as far as the English line. Pretty well, not perhaps decimated, but certainly a lot of them knocked out by the archers who've now switched from the cavalry to shooting at them. But by the time the survivors get to the English line, they're absolutely knackered. They've been tramping through this sticky, awful, sticky mud for 400, 500 yards. They're pretty knackered. They're not disciplined in the way that the English line is disciplined. And of course, the great thing is to knock your opponent down, and then you stick your sword blade in the slit of his visor and say, do you yield? If he does yield, oh yes, sensible chap, yields, right, drop your weapon, get to the because that's your pension. That's your ransom. A lot of them yielded if they weren't killed, yielded, right, drop the weapon, get to the back. The second division, which is coming down as well, they run into the remnants of the first division. They're trying to get away, so there's total chaos there. The third division, which is still way back on the French, thinks, bugger this, or whatever the French say, and they push off. They disappear. They're not getting involved in this. So it looks as if this is a great victory. I may say that by the time the first division had actually closed with the English line, the archers by this stage, they simply drop their bows, pull out their little daggers, and they go in behind and start cutting the hamstrings of these people, which is regarded as very bad form by the French, incidentally. So it looks as if this is great. And then there's a noise from behind. Now, Maisoncelles, which was the village that the English line had got to the night before, that's where the baggage was. There wasn't much baggage left, but that's where the baggage had been left. And it was where the spare ammunition was. And of course, there were runners going backwards and forwards, bringing more arrows forward and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of noise going on there. What's happened? Is this the third French division which has disappeared? Have they come all the way round? And are they attacking the baggage? And are they now going to attack us in rear? And this is where Henry says, kill the prisoners. Now, it was a war crime then, clearly a war crime now. Why does he do it? The reason he does it is that there's all these chaps milling about who've surrendered, have yielded behind his line. There's weapons lying all over the place. Now, if these people decide to actually unyield themselves and pick up a weapon, he could still lose the battle. And that's why he says kill them.
And do you think it's possible that one or two maybe did pick up a weapon to prompt it?
Certainly, certainly possible. Certainly quite possible. And the men-at-arms, of course, say, whoa, hang on, sir, you know, this is my pension. So he says to the archers, do it. The archers didn't have quite the same senses of chivalry, perhaps, as the men-at-arms. And we don't know how many of them were killed. What has actually happened in Maisoncelles, it's the local landlord who's taken a few of his tenants, I mean, there's only a few of them, round to see if they can loot the baggage. And that's what all the noise was about. But of course, King didn't know that at this stage. We don't know how many prisoners were killed. Now, funnily enough, he never really gets, even the French chronicles don't seem to blame him for it. They say he did it, but they didn't say this is disgraceful and we're going to get the Pope to excommunicate you or anything like that. So even they understood the logic. Again, he may not have killed all. We don't know how many he killed, quite simply. We have no idea. So it's a victory.
Are the flower of French chivalry killed?
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. And once again, you know, the whole government of France virtually is either wiped out or a prisoner. What he's now got to do is crack on before another French army could arrive, crack on to Calais. So he does. The English casualties are minuscule. I think there's 2 officers, I think, and a number of soldiers, but you know, peanuts really, unless you happen to be one of them. Off he goes. The locals then, of course, come out, and as they always do, and they loot the battlefield and anything that's recyclable they have away, and they bury the dead. I only know of one. Apparently, there were 5 mass grave pits. I know of one of them, which is sort of forward of the English right flank, which is probably French dead rather than English dead. But there are 4 others, and I don't think they've ever been actually found. I don't think any ground radar work or anything has been done around the battlefield, although the battlefield hasn't changed very much. So they get back to Calais, which of course is English, and eventually they get back to England, and this is wonderful. I mean, the word has already been sent back. It's been read out in every pulpit. No doubt exaggerated, although it'd be quite difficult to exaggerate it because it really was an absolutely stunning victory. And at this stage, the French actually say, right, this is it. I mean, it's been going on for ages. We'll agree to everything that the English want. And even the Queen, the French Queen, declares her son, the Dauphin, to be a bastard, and therefore with no claim to the throne. The French king, of course, is mad. Literally barking mad. He goes around barking. And he believed, the reason he wasn't there was that he believed he was made of glass. So clearly the French king, although made of glass, was not made of crystal. It must have been rather common glass. And of course, if you are made of rather common glass, you really don't want to be on a battlefield. And when he did have to travel anywhere, he was wrapped in straw, because if you're moving glass, you're wrapped in straw. So he was clearly bonkers. His queen says, yeah, my son's a bastard. The French Parlement, which is not the same as the English Parliament, agree that Henry V can be the regent of France, and when Charles dies, he will become the King of France. And he comes back to France and marries Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI. Entirely a dynastic marriage, of course, to begin with. And it becomes a love match, you know, which is great. And he then takes her back to England, where she's crowned as the Queen. She apparently went down very well. People liked her, and everything looks pretty good, and everything north of the Loire is under control of the English. The Dauphin is still somewhere south of the Loire, but nothing really to worry about.
And Henry is the heir to the throne, the French throne.
Yeah, yeah. And if he hadn't then died on a piddling little operation a couple of years later, a little siege operation where he gets, we're not quite sure what it is, but he dies far too young. I mean, he's only 34, and of course his son, who then becomes Henry, whatever it is, of France, Henry VI of England, is a child. So once again, in England, to a certain extent, sort of things turn inwards. And then in France, you've got this nonsense of Joan of Arc.
Well, yes, I was thinking about this, Gordon, is that we should probably do an episode on Joan.
Well, we could easily do a separate one on Joan because she's a fascinating character.
Yeah.
She's not as painted. I mean, she never led men in battle, but she's an interesting character and not stupid.
No, incredible.
Read the transcript of her trial, both her trials are available. And no, she's a very interesting character. And interesting study on how non-military, because really she wasn't military, but how charisma or persuasion can get a whole nation thinking.
Sadly, tragically, Henry dies. It's dysentery as well. The Black Prince.
Yeah, it's probably dysentery. The symptoms seem to be like that, which unfortunately is one of the things that people caught in those days. Hygiene wasn't known, and of course then everything goes downhill. I mean, we struggle on until 1453 or 1552, but the problem really was that the English win all the battles, but they haven't got enough men to hold the land that they take. There's a great several hundred miles of border between Aquitaine and France, another 200 miles or something along the Loire. There just aren't the men to hold that. The population differences, I mean, English population 2 million, maybe 3. Population of France 16 million. So ultimately, in a sense, we lose in that we withdraw, apart from Calais, we keep Calais till 1588. But the claim to the French throne we retained right up until 1802. And the fleur-de-lis remained on the royal coat of arms, the English, British royal coat of arms, right up until 1802. And the only reason we gave it up was that during the Peace of Amiens, which was that brief break during the French Revolutionary Wars, not yet Napoleonic Wars, when England agreed to recognize the French Republic. Now, if you recognize the French Republic, then clearly you have to give up your claim to the throne. So we did. And the fleur-de-lis were removed and replaced by the White Horse of Hanover. Now, actually, the French Republic, and this is my argument, the French Republic only lasted for 2 years because Napoleon then declared himself as emperor. Therefore, we should resurrect the claim to the French throne. And every time I meet a French politician, I say, now, have we thought about resurrecting the claim to the French throne? They don't know what I'm talking about. But politicians don't study history. If they did, they wouldn't make such enormous cock-ups. But I always think it's quite amusing. I mean, I don't seriously think that even if Henry had lived, and things would have been different because the French were beginning to like him. And of course, they liked his French queen, and they might well have accepted Henry VI, who again, of course, went mad. Unfortunately, he inherited the Valois madness through his mother. But would Charles III now be King of France? Probably not. At some stage, I think the crowns would have been divided. It would have gone, the English crown could have gone to a younger son, or the French crown, whatever. So I don't think we'd be united. But things might have been very different if Henry had lived. I mean, I think he's the greatest Englishman ever born. I mean, extraordinary man. King at 25, slaughter of the French nobility at 27, heir to the French throne at 32, and dead at 34.
Yeah, I suppose our own Alexander.
Yeah.
But
unlike Alexander, he wasn't a piss artist.
No. Well, Gordon, this has been absolutely fantastic, and a nice thought to end the discussion today. Daydreaming about England and France being united under one crown, one team, one dream.
Yep.
Gordon, thank you very much. The links to the book. So there's an omnibus where you can get, and you've also written. So you've got Sluice,
And the three,
Crécy,
and
Poitiers.
yeah, but there's also the original book. I mean, hardback,
The 100 Years' War book,
which is
yes.
which is a great and glorious adventure, military history, 100 Years' War.
It's fantastic.
So
Yes,
we can link it to that.
I will link it to that as well.
Great.
Of course. Gordon, fantastic. Thank you.
Not at all. Good to talk to you as always.
Thanks very much for listening. Plenty more great history to come, so please do subscribe or follow. And if you can leave a review, I'd be in your debt. Until then, thank you and good night.